This summer, I decided on something of a whim to finally read Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson. This is a book that was published in 2020, and it made a pretty big stir in the year in which it was published. I assume if you're watching this, that you've at least heard of this book if you haven't already read it, and you may even be familiar already with its basic premise and kind of what it argues. And what it argues is that the United States is a caste system, an actual caste system. That is a caste system that's comparable to the caste system in India, probably the most famous caste system in history, with a very rigid hierarchy of different people falling into 5 different castes, and with so-called untouchables at the bottom of the Indian caste system. Isabel Wilkerson argues that, like India, the United States too, for all of its history and up to today, is and has been a caste system. But unlike India, where membership in caste is based on membership in being a kshatriya, being untouchable, or being a Brahmin, and so on, it's based on primarily race, right? So she argues in this book that the United States, like India, is a caste system. It's just that it's a caste system that is based on race. And I'll read to you her definition of a caste system, in particular how it pertains to the United States. So she writes that a caste system is an artificial construction, a fixed and embedded ranking of human value that sets the presumed supremacy of one group against the presumed inferiority of other groups on the basis of ancestry and often immutable traits that would be neutral in the abstract, like skin color, but are ascribed life and death meaning in a hierarchy favoring the dominant caste whose forebears designed it. A caste system uses rigid, often arbitrary boundaries to keep the ranked groupings apart, distinct from one another and in their assigned places. She goes on to say on the next page about the caste system, elaborating on it a little bit more, that, quote, "It embeds into our bones an unconscious ranking of human characteristics and sets forth the rules, expectations, and stereotypes that have been used to justify brutalities against entire groups within our species. In the American caste system, the signal of rank is what we call race, the division of humans on the basis of their appearance. In America, race is the primary tool and the visible decoy, the frontman for caste." She says as well that race is the skin, caste is the bones, right? And one of the interesting things about this book is, as she continues her discussion of racism, of the American caste system, is she kind of uses unfamiliar terms to refer to race and racism. So she frequently throughout this book, almost always, rather than referring to a black person or an African American person or a white person or a European American person, she will refer to a lower caste person, right? Referring to a black person or another person of color, and an upper caste person as a white person, right? Or other races who have sort of attained a certain degree of status, right? Like Asian Americans and so on. So she kind of also tries to shift her language a little bit, kind of to make the system of racism in this country kind of unfamiliar again, almost to try to make it a little bit alien, in the hopes to help the reader understand it, it seems, which I thought was a really interesting approach. And so going on into kind of what she discusses, she goes through some history in this book. And when I started the book, I kind of expected it to be a history book. And my expectation of that was borne out not only because Isabel Wilkerson's previous book before this one was a history book. It was The Warmth of Other Suns, which was a history of the Great Migration. And so my expectation of this being a history book was based on that, but also based on what she discusses in for a lot of the first sort of third of this book. She talks a lot about, well, American history, right? The history of racism in America and how race was developed as a construct in America. But she also compares the system of racism in America, and in particular the Jim Crow era of segregation in the South, to Nazi Germany. And that is probably the most kind of provocative part of the book, where she's drawing these parallels between what existed in the United States for centuries to what the Nazis did from 1933 to 1945. She actually talks about how when the Nazis first came to power in Germany and they wanted to create a kind of, you could say, apartheid state with Jews as the bottom caste and white, blue-eyed and brown and blonde-haired Aryan white people at the top, when they wanted to do that after they took power, they actually looked to the United States for a model of how to do that, because we had an apartheid state like that already in place. It had been in place for decades. It's called the Jim Crow era. And what might be the most kind of provocative moment in that discussion of how the Nazis looked to America in this way is that there were Nazis who thought that the Jim Crow laws in America went too far, actually. They actually thought that the way that black people and white people in the South were segregated, were forced to use completely separate facilities, was actually too much. So Jim Crow laws in the American South were too much for Nazis. Right, so this discussion of history is extremely provocative, and it's one of the real strengths of the book, I think, is her discussion of history of America and the comparison of America to Nazi Germany. There's also some really powerful passages kind of comparing the callousness of many Germans who knew about and perhaps even lived very close to concentration camps where Jews were being burned, slaughtered, shot, starved, and so on, and just sort of went about living their regular old lives with this happening a few miles away or in their country. She compares that to really one of the most powerful passages in the book to the way lynching happened in the United States, how ubiquitous it was, especially in the South. There's a passage that'll just make your blood boil about the way that postcards with photos of lynched African Americans became this small little market in the postcard industry. At a certain point, they were made illegal, but people kept doing it. Right? So she also makes comparisons like that. And so the historical part of this book is extremely strong, but the kind of heart of the book, I think the heart of this book is what Isabel Wilkerson refers to as the 8 pillars of caste. So these are kind of the eight features of a caste system that make it a caste system and that hold it in place, that keep it in place. All right, so I want to run down these 8 pillars of caste as quickly as I can. I have some quotes I want to read about some of them, but I want to run them down because they're really interesting. So the first pillar, pillar 1, is, as I've written in my notes, it's that the caste system is ordained by God. That somehow this hierarchy with white people at the top and black people at the bottom is somehow divinely inspired, that it is ordained by God, right? The story of Ham in the Bible, one of the sons of Noah, who is supposedly, according to folklore, supposed to be the sort of progenitor of black people. This story was often weaponized to justify slavery and then to justify Jim Crow. And as Isabel Wilkerson writes of this in the book, let me find the page and the location. As she writes, these tenets meaning the supposed divine origin of the caste system, these tenets, as interpreted by those who put themselves on high, would become the divine and spiritual foundation for the belief in a human pyramid willed by God, a great chain of being that the founders would further sculpt in the centuries to the founders of the United States, that is, the founders would further sculpt in the centuries to follow as circumstances required. And so we have what could be called the first pillar of caste, divine will and the laws of nature. So that's pillar one, is that the caste system is divinely ordained. Right? Pillar two is heritability. And this is pretty simple. This is the idea that one's status in the caste system is inherited from one's parents. So you belong to the caste, to the place in the caste system that your parents had. And so this kind of goes back to those one drop rules, where if you had one drop of African American blood, that made you black at many points in American history, right? It's also kind of interesting when she writes about the way that sort of quote-unquote inheritance rules about what race a child belongs to kind of went against patriarchal norms. So throughout most of human history, inheritance was determined by who your father was. But when it came to race in America, someone's status as a black American, as a black person, tended to be determined by who their mother was. And she writes about how the origins of this were white slave owners who raped their female slaves and often ended up siring children. And then because race was inherited through the mother, those white slave owners could claim those children as more slaves. But the point is that one's status in the caste system is inherited. One inherits the status in the caste system from one's parents. All right, pillar three is control of marriage, otherwise known as endogamy. So this forbids marriage across caste boundaries, which in the United States is usually forbidding interracial marriage, right? And this is an interesting one. So let me read some about pillar three. She writes of this, of the injunction not to marry across classes. This is what she says very early in the chapter. Quote, endogamy enforces caste boundaries by forbidding marriage outside of one's group and going so far as to prohibit sexual relations or even the appearance of romantic interest across caste lines. It builds a firewall between castes and becomes the primary means of keeping resources and affinity within each tier of the caste system. So, in part, forbidding marriage across caste boundaries is meant to keep sort of capital within the caste boundaries, right? Because if a black American married up, quote unquote, married a white person, suddenly they would kind of, in a sense, have access to all of these socioeconomic resources that come with that. And so forbidding marriage across caste lines in a way was a way of keeping that social capital within the upper caste, right? Not giving access to people in the lower caste. But also it kind of has to do in part with empathy. She continues on that endogamy, or forbidding marriage across caste lines, quote, makes it less likely that someone in the dominant caste will have a personal stake in the happiness, fulfillment, or well-being of anyone deemed beneath them or personally identify with them or their plight. Endogamy, in fact, makes it more likely that those in the dominant caste will see those deemed beneath them as not only less than human, but as an enemy, as not of their kind, and as a threat that must be held in check at all costs. And so the point of forbidding marriage across caste lines is not just to protect socioeconomic resources, but perhaps more importantly, to make sure that people don't empathize with each other, basically, across caste lines, to keep in particular high caste people, white people, from actually starting to sympathize with the plight of black Americans, right? Because that could be dangerous. That could disrupt the caste system. So anyway, that's pillar three. So pillar four is called purity versus pollution. And so this is the idea, this kind of goes back to the Indian caste system, where there's a class of people in the Indian caste system referred to as the untouchables, who actually are not technically a part of the caste system. They're sort of outside the caste system. They're the bottom rung. But in India, when anyone from a higher caste touches or even comes close to an untouchable, they have to go through this ritual of purification. It's like touching an untouchable literally makes them dirty, literally makes them impure. And you saw that mentality in the United States as well. It's not nearly as explicit, but she talks a lot about, in particular, pools in the Jim Crow South, where in the Jim Crow South, white people didn't even want to swim in water where black people had been swimming any time before. It wasn't even that they didn't want to swim in a pool where there were black people currently swimming. It was that even if the black people had been swimming in the pool the day before or a few hours before, the water was somehow tainted and white people would refuse to swim in it. She tells anecdotes of, in the Jim Crow South, of when pools were ordered to desegregate, to start allowing black people and white people both to use them, of pools just draining the pool instead of allowing black and white people both to use it. Or of letting black people swim, but then after a time when black people had been swimming in it, drain it out and then refill it so that white people could then go and swim. And she also tells this really heartbreaking anecdote of a young black boy who was on a sports team, and I can't remember what the specific sports team was, but he was on a sports team in the Jim Crow South where he was the only black boy on the team. So all the rest of the team were white. And the sports team went to the pool to go swim, and the pool authorities would not allow this black boy to swim. And he was forced to not only not enter the pool, but not even to enter the pool area. He actually had to wait outside the fenced area of the pool area. And at the end of the visit of this sports team to this pool, the pool authorities finally let this black boy swim in the pool, but they only let him do it after everyone else had left the pool, had gotten out of the pool, and they wouldn't let him touch the water. They let him get onto a floaty and be pulled around the pool by a lifeguard. So, yeah, that's kind of a heartbreaking anecdote. And anyway, it speaks to kind of this idea of purity, of this idea that white people seem to view the presence of black people, the presence of African Americans, as somehow dirtying the place up, especially when it's a place like a pool, right? All right, pillar 5 is occupational hierarchy, right? And this one's pretty straightforward. So this is the idea that the jobs that are open to people from different castes kind of reflect their status in the caste system. So the jobs that historically have been open for African Americans have tended to happen to be pretty low status, low paying, intense, labor intense jobs. So there's a lot made of the fact that for a lot of black women, for much of American history, one of the only professions open to them was being a maid for white families, right? She also talks about how one of the industries in which black people have been allowed to thrive is in the entertainment industry, right? There's a long history of black performers, black dancers, black musicians, of course, and so on. And that is kind of rooted in this as well. I mean, it's also rooted in black cultural traditions, but the thing is that whites didn't mind having black people entertain them because it was viewed as kind of a low status endeavor, right? You're going to be our entertainment for the night, right? So anyway, the idea here is that the jobs that are open to people from lower caste backgrounds tend to be low paying, tend to be menial, and so on, whereas the upper castes will be able to enter into higher paying professions and so on and so forth. So that's pillar 5. Pillar number 6 is dehumanization and stigma. So people from lower castes are stigmatized, stereotyped, made to seem less than human, essentialized, right? Through a lot of ways, through the way that they're referred to, through certain slurs, but also in things like how they're represented in media, in television shows and films. And what she says, and I would agree with her, is that dehumanizing an entire group of people, stereotyping an entire group of people, essentializing them, reducing them to this one quality about them, makes it a lot easier for people to accept the horrible things that are done to them, right? And it kind of echoes what she was saying about why intermarriage was forbidden. This is what she writes. Individuals were lumped together for sharing a single stigmatizing trait, made indistinct and indistinguishable in preparation for the exploitation and atrocities that would be inflicted upon them. Individuals were no longer individuals. Individuality, after all, is a luxury afforded the dominant caste. Individuality is the first distinction lost to the stigmatized. Okay? And she goes on to say how dehumanization of the Jews was instrumental in the Nazis being able to kill 6 million of them. So that's pillar number 6. Pillar number 7 is terror as enforcement, cruelty as a means of control. So this is the use of violence and terror to keep people from lower castes in fear as a way of controlling them. And so when slavery was still around, the mechanisms for this were rape, were beatings, were capturing slaves if they'd escaped and killing or putting them back in slavery. There was, of course, lynching in the Jim Crow South. And up to today, there is, of course, police violence, which disproportionately targets black people. Okay, and then pillar 8. Pillar 8 kind of is implicit in a lot of these other ones, but pillar 8 is the idea of the inherent superiority of one group and the inherent inferiority of another group. All right, and I'm gonna read another passage here about this one. All right, and this is what she says of this. Beneath each pillar of caste was the presumption and continual reminder of the inborn superiority of the dominant caste and the inherent inferiority of the subordinate. It was not enough that the designated groups be separated for reasons of pollution, quote unquote, or that they not intermarry, or that the lowest people suffer due to some religious curse, but that it must be understood in every interaction that one group was superior and inherently deserving of the best in a given society, and that those who were deemed lowest were deserving of their plight. And so that is the final pillar of caste, this idea that somehow people from the upper castes must just be smarter, harder working, more physically able, whatever, that people from lower castes must just be less intelligent, must be lazy, must be violent, and so they deserve their place. Right? That's the last pillar of caste. And so I've gone over the 8 pillars of caste in some depth because I think they're a really powerful articulation of the system of racial oppression in the United States, and driven home by some brilliant prose. I hope that the excerpts that I've read from this book have driven home just how powerfully written it is. It really is magnificently eloquent, and that is something I can say without any reservations about this book. She goes on after the discussion of the 8 pillars of caste to kind of unpack the way that these 8 pillars are manifested in a lot of different walks of life, in a lot of different segments of society, in a lot of different ways. She talks about, for example, how for white people who are poor, who are lower on the socioeconomic rung, having black people as a lower caste kind of helps them to feel better about their own position, that they can feel better about being poor and disadvantaged because they know that they're not on the bottom rung of society. So she talks about that. She talks about how sometimes among people from the lower castes, people from lower castes will turn on each other if they perceive that one of their own is trying to rise in the sort of caste ladder. They will actually turn on each other sometimes. She talks about how black people in America often are used as kind of scapegoats for various social problems, like problems with drugs, problems with crime, and so on. She also, very briefly, for about 10 pages, talks about the effect of the caste system on the physical health of people who are lower caste, of black people. How it literally, facing racism and discrimination your entire life can have a physical effect on you, can put you at greater risk of high blood pressure, can make you age faster, and so on and so forth. And then near the end of the book, she actually turns to talking about the 2016 election, the election of Donald Trump, and how white backlash, as it's referred to, probably played a large role in that and in what we've seen since, of course. Insofar as the election of Donald Trump came immediately after 2 terms of the first black president in American history. And she kind of argues that having our first black president seemed like this kind of so-called glass ceiling breaking moment. And that made a lot of racist white people quake in their shoes at the idea of black people actually breaking the caste system, right? And so they worried about their own status in this caste system. She also talks a little bit about 2042, the year 2042, I believe that's the year, when the United States is predicted to become majority-minority. That is where white people will become a minority racial group, and the United States will be majority people from other ethnic backgrounds. Whether that's going to happen, given the current political climate where we're going now, I don't know. But she also talks about that at some length, and a lot of this is really interesting, and there's a lot of good stuff in it. She makes a lot of good points. The problem is I think she tries to cover a little bit too much. A lot of these topics that she covers are things that could have and often have had entire books written about them alone, and she'll give them like 5 to 10 pages. You know, the one that really leapt out to me in that regard was the discussion of the effect of racism on physical health. That's a huge subject. And she devotes 10 pages to it, right? It's not very much. It's an introduction at best. And so parts of it do feel a little surface level. I will say another reservation I have about this book, although it's a qualified reservation if that's possible, is that she relies a lot on anecdotal evidence. She relies a lot on just talking about anecdotes from history, like the one that I told about the black boy at the pool. She tells a really powerful anecdote about Martin Luther King Jr. visiting India and being referred to as an American untouchable when he was there. There are some really powerful anecdotes that she does tell in support of her arguments. Another anecdote that really stands out as a powerful one that I wanted to bring up here was she has a whole chapter about Allison Davis. Allison Davis was a black anthropologist who, with his wife Elizabeth and their partners, the Burleigh and Mary Gardner, who were white, the 4 of them, led by Allison Davis, in the 1930s, they went to live in the Jim Crow South. They went to live in Natchez, Mississippi, just to kind of study life in the Jim Crow South, what it was like to be a white couple and what it was like to be a black couple, and what they could and could not do, what rules regulated their behavior and how they could interact with each other. So they kind of went undercover into the Jim Crow South to study what life was like down there. And they wrote a book that was published in 1941 in which they kind of make the same argument as Isabel Wilkerson, that the United States had a caste system, had and has a caste system. So really, this anecdote shows that Isabel Wilkerson in this book isn't necessarily presenting anything new in a way. I mean, she is presenting a lot that's new. I don't mean to say it's unoriginal, but really what she's doing more so is popularizing an idea that had already been put forward and discussed in academic circles. Admittedly, somewhat niche academic circles, but nonetheless. So there are some really powerful anecdotes, but the book does... But I have to say that the book does rely so much on anecdotal evidence, when I think that more proper data would really drive home her points a bit better, or if she'd been able to pair some more historical references and data with her anecdotes, I think it would have worked a bit better. And the fact that she relies on anecdotal evidence as well just contributed to my feeling that the discussion of some of the various points was a little bit more superficial than it could have been. But the biggest problem with a lot of the anecdotes, though, is the fact that a lot of them are kind of predictable. Not in the sense that you know what's going to happen in the anecdote, but in the sense where at a certain point in the book, you basically know what she's going to say about the anecdote, how she's going to interpret the anecdote before she gets to that part. She always ends up kind of giving some interpretation of the anecdote based on the workings of the caste system as she sees it. And at a certain point in the book, you can kind of just see it for yourself before she even explains it. You know what I mean? And that can get kind of tedious at a certain point. And then a couple more reservations. And again, they're reservations. These aren't strong criticisms. They're just kind of reservations that I think made the book a little bit less strong than it could have been. Isabel Wilkerson argues that the only 3 pure caste systems in history were in India, the most well-known one, in the United States, as she spends the whole book talking about, and in Nazi Germany from 1933 to 1945. And she claims that, and I'm not saying she's wrong exactly, but I do feel like there are some other notable examples of caste systems or something close to a caste system that she overlooks. I mean, the obvious one that leapt out to me was apartheid South Africa, which she does mention in passing, actually, but doesn't really elaborate on. And I feel like that's a bit of a gap, because that was a pretty clear caste system, apartheid South Africa. It was basically like the Jim Crow South, but in the second half of the 20th century. And then another one that I thought of, frankly, was Israel, the way that Palestinians are treated in Israel. Obviously, this is very topical at the moment, but it's been going on for decades now. Palestinian people, not only those who live in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, but Palestinians who live in Israel are treated differently than Israelis, than Jewish people in Israel. You know, they are treated like second-class citizens. They have different license plates. And if you have a Palestinian license plate, you can't drive certain places. You can't go certain places. You get pulled over by the cops more frequently, and so on and so forth. And so I feel like that's also kind of an oversight. And so, again, it felt like a gap in the book. And then my last reservation, and it's not really a reservation even, it's just something that I was feeling while reading this, was that this did feel like a pretty basic introduction to racism in America. I mean, that's basically what it is, right? And hopefully that's pretty clear based on my own discussion of the 8 pillars of caste and so on. It basically is an introduction to racism in America. And I imagine that this book would be mind-blowing, would be so educational to someone who knew nothing about racism in America, you know? And the thing is I think for people who have thought about this a lot, have learned a lot about it, have read a lot about it, this book can feel a little bit basic, or at least like she's basically preaching to the crowd. And so that felt a little bit underwhelming. And then at the very end here, last kind of reservation is she uses a lot of kind of artsy metaphors to seemingly to try to reel in the reader. She uses metaphors about like acting, about taking care of a house, and all this. She uses these sort of artsy metaphors that feel a little unnecessary and feel like they're trying really hard to like reel in an uninterested reader. And I just kind of felt like, we don't need that. I mean, when you're writing a book like this, when you're writing as powerfully as she writes, you don't need to use these metaphors to get people interested. I don't know. So those are my thoughts on Caste. I do recommend it. If anything I've said has sounded interesting, then I do recommend it, absolutely. And if nothing else, the writing is brilliant, as I hope I showed in my reading from the book. But anyway, I will leave it at that. Let me know if you've read Caste and what you think of it if you're watching. I'd love to discuss it with some people because there's just so much to chew on in it. But I'll leave it at that, and I'll talk to you all in my next video.